I introduced Sanjeev Sanyal ji as our chief guest today, but also he's currently a member of the Economic Advisory Council to the Prime Minister. Earlier, he was the principal economic advisor to the finance minister and the co-chair of the G20's Framework Working Group. And he's also the global strategist and the managing director at was at the Deutsche Bank. He was awarded the Eisenhower Fellowship in 2007. He was named as a young global leader by the World Economic Forum in 2010. And his passion, if I can say so, as being the author of the best-selling books, Land of the Seven Rivers, The Ocean of Churn, India in the Age of Ideas, and the Indian Renaissance. So I'm just going to invite Sanjeev Sanyal ji to say a few words. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Now I have to live up to it. I'm going to break rules and walk around if you don't mind. Okay, so first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here for the very first, the inaugural Auroville Literature Festival. So congratulations, Jayanti ji and your team for this amazing event at an amazing venue. And also to Sanjeev ji and Thiru ji for gracing the occasion. It's going to be an exciting couple of days, I'm sure. So I was wondering what I should say in an event like this, because speaking about Sri Aurobindo in Auroville is a bit daunting, because everybody here probably knows more about Sri Aurobindo than I do. So I wondered, what can one say about a person who was not merely, in a sense, the father of India's freedom struggle, particularly the revolutionary and armed resistance to British occupation of India. But he was also a key figure in the intellectual, cultural, spiritual renaissance and rebirth of India. And this is particularly important at this juncture of history, when we in India, when this country is finally kind of clawing back its space in the world community. Whether it's just day before yesterday, the Chandrayaan landing on the moon, or India's growing stature in the world. Something that Sri Aurobindo, in a sense, triggered all those years ago. So given his multifaceted personality and the extraordinary contributions that he made, what can we say about him? And I thought here, there is a problem very often I face, at least, maybe it's not true in here, but when I meet people who have been inspired by him, they tend to think of his contributions in silos. In fact, very often they are embarrassed by other parts of his contribution. So those who may follow his somewhat universalist spiritual writings sometimes feel somewhat embarrassed by his writings on, and very fiercely nationalist writings about fighting the British colonialists, or about civilizational reawakening, and so on. So, the issue here is, how does all of these things fit together? And I think in order to understand this, you need to understand the context from which he arose. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that, because then much of what he writes makes absolute sense. So very often this wider context of 19th century India is not fully appreciated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that, and I thought many people may find that interesting. Let's go back to the late 19th century, exactly about 151 years back, when Sri Aurobindo was born. He was, of course, then called Aurobindo Ghosh. And this is a time when India, but specifically Bengal, was in many ways a crisis. Remember, Bengal had been, by this point, under foreign occupation for hundreds of years. Not just under the British and the East India Company, but before that under the Mughals, before that under the Afghans, and before that under the Turks. So other parts of India may have had some relief in bits and pieces, whether this part of India under the Vijayanagar Empire, or under the Maratha Empire and so on. But Bengal had been continuously under foreign occupation now for hundreds of years, almost at that point 700 years or thereabouts. And this had been a period of continuous resistance to this occupation as well. So there had been the resistance of the Baro Bhuiya, 12 chieftains in Bengal. There had been the Sannyasi revolt. There had been the Indigo revolt. Or in fact, the Indigo revolt had happened, just a few decades before Sri Aurobindo was born. So there had been this enormous amount of political military resistance, but it had failed. And in 1857-58, the Great Revolt that happened across India, that too failed. And Bengal specifically faced a great amount of not just political, but also economic exploitation. This had been, even under the Mughals, despite being under foreign rule, it had remained a reasonably prosperous province till the 18th century, and then had been completely impoverished within a 100-year period under the East India Company. The forced growing of indigo and opium and the continuous drain of wealth meant that by 1770, Bengal faced an extreme famine in which something like a quarter of its population died of starvation. So then there were periodic epidemics, famines, and so on, which caused absolute havoc in this part of the world. And then came something even more insidious in a way, which was cultural domination. So you had, of course, the writings of Macaulay, the writings of James Mill, which essentially presented India and its civilization as something brutish, as something that needed, in a way, to be civilizationally reformed. And by the way, even that included the writings of Karl Marx, who otherwise is very often seen as being on the side of those under colonial or other kinds of exploitation. But when it came to India, Karl Marx was rather a supporter of the British occupation of India. Many people do not know this. And then came, after that, a sharp increase from around about 1830 in Christian missionary activity as well in Bengal. So in this sort of economic, political domination, cultural crisis, there was a response in India generally, but specifically in Bengal, what is often seen as a debate between the orthodox response on one side and the response of the westernizing Brahmos. You may have heard of Raja Ram Mohan Roy. And there is this big debate that happens about how to modernize India, Indian civilization, social mores, and so on. But what is interesting is that between the two, there was a third stream, which is less talked about, but in fact was by some margin, the most important stream that was there. And that was of the modernizing revivalists. Now, the modernizing revivalists agreed with the westernizing Brahmos about the need for social reforms. But they agreed with the Orthodox on the need for continuing various ancient texts, practices, and ideas. And in a sense, reviving Indic culture, Hinduism, Sanatan Dharma, and so on. Now, who was the founder, in a sense, of this modernist revivalist movement is also a very interesting character. Again, outside of Bengal, not much remembered, but she was actually a widow, a very wealthy businesswoman, and actually came from a low caste, a caste that we would today call Dalits. And her name, by the way, is Rani Rashmoni. And Rani Rashmoni began to fund a bunch of scholars, writers, temples across Bengal in a way to kind of trigger this modernist revivalist movement. So what did they want? They first of all wanted to rapidly modernize India, flood it with new ideas, but at the same time retain the best from the past. And so she built, for example, the Dakshineshwar temple. And who did she hire, in a sense, to become the head temple priest? She got Ramakrishna Paramhans to do it. And of course, with that got triggered a sequence of events and disciples leading to the rise of Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda then, contributed another round of reviving of ideas, thoughts, etc. And so, in a sense, the tide slowly began to turn. So this is the context in which Sri Aurobindo was born, of this new form of sort of very early stage of revival in pride in Indic civilizational values. But interestingly, he didn't come from a family where this was the dominant idea. Just like there were people who were kind of trying to push back against colonial domination, there were also Indians who sided with the colonial occupiers of India. And this was particularly true for one of the branches of the Brahmo movement, to which, interestingly, Sri Aurobindo's father belonged. So Sri Aurobindo's father was so keen to ingratiate himself with the British colonial administration, he banned the speaking of Bengali at home. They had to speak in English. And then once his children were a little bit older, not yet in their teens, but just a little bit older, he packed 3 of them off, including Aurobindo Ghosh, to England to live completely cut off from Indian civilization, to be brought up essentially as Englishmen. And then to go, he hoped, to write the ICS, the Indian Civil Service examination, so that they could come back to India as Pakka Englishmen and rule the country. Now, Aurobindo Ghosh, as a teenager, essentially did not know Bengali. He did not know any Indian language at all. And it was only when he began to study in Cambridge for his exams, his ICS exams, that he began to rediscover India. So in a sense, he rediscovered India from an outsider's point of view. And it triggered something in him. And much to the disappointment of his father, he refused to join the ICS, but he did come back to India. And by the way, the disappointment is so great that it is said his father died of heartbreak when he heard the news that his son had refused to join the ICS. But he came back to India and he joined the service of another remarkable man, Sayaji Gaikwad of Baroda, who was one of the rulers of one of the princely states, but quite a subversive one. He would go on to actually fund quite a few remarkable people, of course, Sri Aurobindo, but also Bhimrao Ambedkar and several others. And so, as Sri Aurobindo came back, he began to then rediscover India literally, literally step by step. He began to read. He relearned Bengali. He was learning Sanskrit before he came, but that's when he really got going. And in fact, not many people know this, that right to the end of his days, he used to speak Bengali with a somewhat odd accent. Those who knew him at that time would remark on this. Now, why did I tell you this long story? This long story needs to be told because, in some ways, he had been emptied out by this experience that he had had. He had been deracinated and emptied out, and he had to fill back that nihilism, that space that was inside him, step by step. And much of his life is really about trying to fill that space back. So the first part of what he tries to do is push back against the political domination of India. And that is the context in which he creates this network of akhadas or gymnasiums to fight the British through armed resistance. This network was called the Anushilan Samiti. It literally means the discipline or training committee. Now, why would something like a revolutionary movement be called the discipline or training committee or training institute? Such a strange name to have. The reason for that was that Sri Aurobindo, this network that he was creating was actually a network of gymnasiums, or what we call akhadas. As it happened to be, one of those akhadas was also run by my family in Varanasi. And this network of akhadas then started the sequence of events that led to the revolutionary movement being built. It was also a time that he wrote a very interesting booklet called Bhavani Mandir. So the Bhavani Mandir needs to be seen in the context of his attempt to create a framework through these akhadas of trying to revive a martial tradition in India. So again, very often forgotten that these akhadas have existed in India for thousands of years and had played a very important role in resistance against foreign occupation, even in medieval times. So it was under British rule that many of them had basically been demilitarized. So when you go to the Kumbh Mela and you see these akhadas go for a tip, remember that they were not purely religious bodies. These akhadas were actually quasi-religious military orders. And there were some of them would, the European equivalents of that would be the Knights Templar or something like that. So many of them had fought the Turks, they had fought the Mughals, they had also fought, by the way, the British in the early phase. And that's what the Sannyasi revolt was about. It was about these monk warriors. And so what Sri Aurobindo was trying to do is to revive this network of monk warriors. And he writes about them in this 18-page booklet called Bhavani Mandir, which is quite interesting, which I'll come back to in the end. Because that short booklet is actually the inspiration for an organization that still exists today called the RSS. If you go and read it, you'll see that the framework on which the entire Rashtriya Swayam Sangh is built is that short booklet called the Bhavani Mandir. Now, of course, this particular episode ends with the Alipur bomb case. His brother is sent off to Kalapani. Many of those who had supported him in this first round of rebellion against the British are either incarcerated or hanged, and Sri Aurobindo himself escapes first to Chandanagar and then right here to Pondicherry, and he would then spend the rest of his life. There were many of his colleagues from those days who were quite disappointed with this, which, by the way, includes Sachindranath Sanyal, my granduncle, who was a very important leader of the Anushilan Samiti movement. And he writes about it as well. But I think what happens here is not just a mere transformation in a spiritual sense. What happens here is a realization that India didn't merely need political freedom. His own experience, particularly his own family's experience, was that of emptying out, of deracination. And he felt that the real battle was reigniting the civilizational lamp and a rediscovery, which he then embarks on here in Pondicherry. And so you then begin to see him writing books like The Secret of the Vedas, and then Savitri and other books writings that he has. And much of this then comes together in this idea. And I think it's quite remarkable that more than 100 years ago, he came to the conclusion that once he had triggered the sort of sequence of events, it was a matter of time before India got political independence. So he left and began to engage in a different battle, the battle of civilizational reawakening, the battle against deracination, which he thought was the more significant battle. And this is quite an insight, I have to say, because a century later, 75 years after independence, this is an issue that is still debated today. We are not debating whether or not to gain political freedom anymore. That's a 75-year-old problem which we solved. But this problem of thinking about it, reviving Indic ideas, Indian civilization. And then he takes the next step. He takes the next step of saying that this is not only about reviving a civilization for India's own sake. These are universalist ideas. And that these are ideas worth spreading to the rest of the world. Now, 100 years later, we are thinking about the idea of India as Vishwaguru. Isn't that incredible? That a spark, in a sense, that he lit, saw through India's independence, saw through 75 years of first 75 years of India's independence, and then thinks through to a time, now today, when India is going through a renaissance in multiple fields. All of a sudden, India is beginning to sort of gain its rightful place in the world stage. Sri Aurobindo's ideas suddenly become relevant. So I think, therefore, having a Auroville Literature Festival right here in Auroville, a city inspired by his ideas, is absolutely a great idea. So thank you very much once again, Jayanti ji, for inviting me. And with that, let me hand this back.